All right, thank you. My name is Clay Purvis. I'm the Director for Telecommunications and Connectivity for the Department of Public Service. You've asked me to provide you an update on the microcell RFP and where we are with that. I've provided for you a letter that outlines where we are. My testimony today, I just plan to read that letter. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer those questions. By this letter, the Department of Public Service provides an update on the state's microcell network and its efforts to find a successor operator. The microcell network was a project developed by the Vermont Telecommunications Authority to bring wireless voice coverage to roadways unserved by the major wireless carriers. As you know, the state's original contractor, Banyu Coverage Co., failed to deliver on its contractual obligation to build and operate a wireless network in accordance with the applicable requirements and specifications of its contract. Last summer, the department afforded Coverage Co. ample opportunity to cure its contractual breaches and to demonstrate that the company had a viable business plan. Unfortunately, Coverage Co. proved unable to do so. Therefore, the department terminated the master lease agreements with the company. The department thereafter issued a request for proposals seeking a successor vendor to provide cell coverage in place of Coverage Co. The department received 2 proposals, both from companies with proven track records of deploying wireless networks. The department is currently assessing these proposals to determine whether there is good cause to conclude that either proposal has a better prospect of succeeding where Coverage Co. failed. The department has held meetings with each vendor and is thoroughly reviewing each company's business model. One vendor has proposed operating small cell and macro sites using a real estate model in which carriers pay a flat fee for use of the site. The second vendor has proposed a novel solution that would involve civilian application of aerostat technology along the lines of equipment already in use by the military. It is important to note that the department received no response to the RFP that proposed to simply revive the Coverage Co. microcell model and operate the network as originally designed. This is a strong indication that the private market alone does not see microcells as a viable means of serving rural and sparsely populated areas.
Could we just interject and ask you to help me understand application of aerostat technology?
Blimps, tethered blimps, that would be.
Okay, so this is the way to deal with pole infrastructure, but with blimps?
Yes.
I was told balloons.
Balloons, yes. They would be deployed at much higher elevations than the traditional. They're about covering a larger area.
So would either permanently?
They can be retracted and deployed as needed. Some can be moved, some are stationary.
The military uses these?
Yes.
London during the
Spying
days.
on Cuba with
Ridgeline
aerostats
just
for the
dropped.
last 50 years. The department shares the committee's sense of urgency about the continuing lack of cell coverage in many parts of Vermont. That said, questions concerning the viability of each of the 2 vendors' business models remain, and the department is working diligently with both companies to obtain information needed to move forward with the solution that makes responsible use of the $900,000 that was appropriated by the legislature. The department is intent on ensuring that these funds are used responsibly and are not misspent on another failed wireless broadband project. In addition to the RFP process, the department is also working to identify and examine other options using the microcell equipment. For instance, the department is considering a proposal developed by PSD staff last summer that proposes to lease the equipment to towns or private entities to cover the per site costs, while the state contracts with a vendor for core network functions. For a modest fee, towns would have direction over the placement of the microcells, and carriers would roam at very low or fixed costs, or for free. Vermont's prospects for expanding rural cell coverage are in large part tied to gaining access to federal funds. In March of 2018, the Federal Communications Commission announced the availability of $4.5 billion for the Mobility Fund Phase 2 program. This past fall, the department engaged in a statewide drive test of wireless LTE coverage under this program. The purpose of the drive test was to challenge propagation maps submitted to the FCC. It is our hope that the FCC will rely on our data and open larger areas of land to the program. During the drive test, the department staff took special note of existing and planned microcell sites. In its testing, the department found that over 2/3 of the existing and planned microcell sites had wireless coverage from at least one of the 6 major carriers. The data show that of the 193 installed coverage code sites, 135 have cell coverage of some kind from another carrier. And this following chart breaks down each site by carrier.
So we have 58 sites that have no coverage, right?
Correct.
From any.
The department also found areas in need of coverage that were not contemplated in the coverage code deployment. Without reliance on expensive and inaccurate propagation studies, the department has identified existing coverage gaps. This data indicates a clear need for us to redefine our coverage goals and design a wireless solution that best meets those goals.
Okay. So, part of the concern, our concern, is the availability of E911 service. So, if I'm remembering correctly, any place that's got, any carrier, if I push 911, no matter whose coverage I've got, whoever's on that pole has to take it.
Assuming that your handset can connect to that tower, yes. And that's becoming more available.
Why wouldn't my handset be able to connect to the tower? If I'm driving down the road and I'm having chest pains and there's a microcell there, would the 911 call be picked up? If there was one carrier that was using that microcell, or?
Yes, there are different, carriers relied on 2 different types of technology that is slowly converging to VoLTE, voice over LTE. So in the old days, GSM and CDMA were 2 different types of technology. Verizon used one and AT&T used the other. T-Mobile used CDMA, Sprint used GSM.
Okay, I do remember that. Part of the problem with Coverage Co. was we got a new 911 vendor, supplier, and when Coverage Co. signed up, there was no pole fee or connection fee for 911. The new vendor put a $50 fee per pole, and that's part of, or a big part of, what blew the Coverage Co. finance plan. Have the department been talking to the 911 board about perhaps doing something about that? Because it sounds like we had at least a relatively viable, there's chairs there if you want to unfold one, a relatively viable business plan when Coverage Co. came in, which wasn't viable once that fee went on. Have the department had any discussions with the 911 board on waiving that fee perhaps in high-need areas?
I do want to go back to the core of your question. There was never a time when that fee was not applicable to Coverage Co. or to any other carrier. That has always been a requirement of the SEC.
That isn't what I remember being told last year. I specifically remember we did a new contract and that fee went in. Maybe the FCC rules changed.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand which contract you're referring to.
Whoever provides the telephone service, and committee help me with this,
Well, I mean, I remember a change
Yes.
that had to do with this fee, and that hit the coverage code. Is that,
Yes.
can you help us remember those details?
Well, I can give you a little bit of history about when coverage code came into the state, how that fee was addressed. So, the FCC, beginning in the early 2000s, imposed on wireless carriers 911 obligations, so that they had to carry 911 calls. So there's phase 1 and 2, and there was a precursor to phase 1, which required them. Phase 1 was you have to carry a 911 call of any person, regardless of whether they're a customer.
That's if
So,
I hit
yeah.
911.
So that's almost 20 years old
Yeah.
now, that requirement. Phase 1 was that now carrier, you have to inject into the 911 system location data. So the
The
GPS port.
E911.
And that was, I think, 2000, I'm gonna look at 2004? 2004, they imposed that. So that's industry-wide. Every carrier has to now deliver to the 911 network coordinates of the caller within, I think, 100-meter accuracy. Phase 2 was to change the level of accuracy. Now it's something like 50 meters. So that they get coordinates that are within 50 meters of that call. Every carrier has always had to comply with that, and when coverage code came into Vermont, it was their desire not to comply with that. That was of concern, I think, to the 911 board at the time, because if they started granting waivers for one carrier, they were gonna start getting, it was a slippery slope argument, in other words. Coverage code was not aware until they were made aware by 911 and by other entities in the state that they would have to comply with that. So that was a challenge for them. Their initial contracts with West were very high, and actually Banu and his company were very good about negotiating down those fees. So $50 a site is very low for a site. What's difficult about coverage code's model was that they had many, many sites. So a macro site is going to pay the same similar fee that a micro
Oh,
cell
so
site.
if you put up a cell tower, you pay the 50 or whatever. If you put up 10 microcells on phone poles to cover, I don't know, how far does a microcell cover?
About a radius of a quarter mile, so you're covered a half mile on both.
All right, so you almost have to put one up on every phone pole, which is a lot more expensive than a cell tower, but they don't work.
As I recall, the story that Coverage Co. related to us is they initially were getting the geolocation services without charge from a vendor that the state had contracted with to provide other services, and so they did not have to pay for it. It was only subsequently, when the state changed vendors, that the new vendor did not agree to provide the coverage, but they indicated their business model was based on receiving the geolocation services without charge. And one of the reasons that their business model didn't work is because of that imposition of the charge later in the process. Does that make sense?
So the 911 board at one point had a contract with Intrado
Yeah, correct.
to provide the 911 network. And if that was a provision of the Intrado agreement, I'm not aware of it. But when we took over the Coverage Co project in
Yeah.
2015.
Yeah, well, at
They-
that
they-
point,
they
it was
had
later in
already-
the process, and the state's vendor for E911 had changed, and the new vendor would not provide the geolocation services without charge. And that's what they claim is the principal reason, aside from the AT&T problem, that their business model failed.
I'll have to look into that.
Well,
I'm
I
not
guess
aware.
my question is, if prior to that coverage, or that change, that this was a viable model. And we're trying to find another vendor. And it sounds like they're not knocking down the doors to get in here to do a 2G. What are we trying to do if we think that the 2G cells are the best way to get basic emergency services up some of these back roads? Are we doing anything? Can we do anything? Is this the contract that's presently being negotiated at at the 911 board?
The 911 board is negotiating a contract with a vendor for the next 911 network. And I
Okay,
don't
so
have any
this
instructions.
it has nothing to do with this?
Nothing.
Okay.
I would say that both proposals, without discussing them too much, but they are under review, are proposing LTE networks. So the equipment that we have would only be a stopgap at the very least, or at the very best rather. And it would not be the ultimate wireless solution. The other thing I think it's important to note is that both of their preferences for a macro solution. Micro cells have a place in wireless networks, but providing coverage along rural routes is probably not the best application of them. And then third, we have been considering other ways, as we've stated in our letter, to both make use of these microcells and to think about 911 emergency service. So that would be perhaps thinking of 911 access without the use of wireless technology.
I have so many questions because I'm still trying to learn this way, but I'll try to spare you to some degree. But just so I understand, one of the things I'm struggling with is that this whole microcell strategy as a state, we bought some, 400?
Yeah.
How many of them?
About 400, yeah.
About 400. When was that?
We started buying them in 2012 through 2015.
That,
So
after
as recently as 4 years ago, we were still buying them. So, and were you at the department then, or that's your predecessor?
I was there, but we had no control over how the contracts were written. I mean, they
Well,
were in
but
place.
still
I
have.
want to try to step through it so that I can understand. So this was our strategy, right? Or this was a part of our strategy to fill the gaps, to try to push,
Yes.
places where the private market was not going. We said, okay, this is the right way to do it. We personally, the state owns these boxes, right? I don't know if they're boxes, but
They're in boxes.
great. And some of them are in a warehouse somewhere, right?
I heard some of them were in Puerto Rico. Have they come back?
Most of them never went, but yes, they
They never
did.
went. All right.
Well, that seems to be the theme. So we have 193 of them of the 400 are out there. So we've installed 193, it says from your letter. So there's just over 200 somewhere in a box.
Yeah.
And was Coverage Co. the first vendor that said yes, they would run these for us? They would administer them, operate them? What would
The
be
VTA issued an RFP
Yeah.
to anyone to provide cell service in these predetermined areas, which they determined with a propagation study.
Who they? The vendor?
The VTA. We won
Telecom.
the Vermont Telecom Authority. They received one proposal, and that was from Van New Coverage Co.
Okay. And then the billing dynamics shifted and Coverage Co. was no longer viable, right?
I would
I
argue
mean, there were
that
changes, that's what I think Senator Brock, I don't wanna put words in his mouth, but there was something that changed
Yeah.
rather dramatically last year.
The only Vanu Bose died, but I would argue that the business model was never viable from the get-go.
Well, it's unfortunate to hear the state contracts with business models it doesn't think is viable, but something shifted, right? I mean, was it this 911 charge? Was it the roaming thing? I mean,
Or the
was it
geolocation.
unworkable from the very first time we turned it on?
I think they were upside down fairly quick after turning it on, yes.
Well, they would argue, I believe, that two things happened. One, they were getting geolocation services without charge. The state changed a vendor, and they then had to pay geolocation services, which was one significant charge. The second thing they counted on, as I understand it, was that all of the cell phone vendors would be paying them for calls that came through. However, AT&T declined to do so. Those two things put their business model upside down. At least that's what their claim was. Do you think, was there anything else that you saw wrong beside that?
I think I would agree with you that that's what they claim, but I can't, like I said, I cannot vouch for this notion that they were getting free 911, free Intrado services. That's something I will look into.
Okay.
But-
When did you inherit?
2015. July 1st.
2015, okay. So you inherited this thing pretty far down the road to a mess.
Yes.
Okay.
And this line caught my eye in that it's generally, nearly all of the installed cells are redundant.
2/3.
Yeah. And I mean, who do we look to for answers about that?
I think there are a couple of reasons why. One, the deployment was based on a propagation study that the VTA had commissioned in 2010, and then they did a second one in 2013. And between 2013, so I can't vouch for the well,
Right.
I have
You
my
didn't-
own experience with that propagation model is that it is inaccurate. And then between 2013 to about 2016, there was a significant amount of deployment by wireless carriers in the state, both in terms of upgrading and expanding coverage. So they were overbooked.
Okay, and one of the principles around these microcells is that they're neutral, right? Like any carrier can use them, is that right?
Yes.
And as we're moving forward and limping along with some 2G, and you're under discussions with another vendor that sounds like they want to do 4G, will that hold in the neutral? Is that part of the discussion that they would be neutral?
Both vendors are third-party carriers. That means they would affiliate with one or more of the major international space carriers and carry their signal for them.
So they would not be neutral.
No, they would. They are not one of the 6 major carriers. They would affiliate with one or more, much like Coverage Co did. Coverage Co had roaming agreements with each of the major carriers. The same neutral host model has the potential to apply.
So they would pick up regular calls.
No matter who.
Well,
No.
assuming they have an agreement with the major carriers. So that would be something that we would look for before we spend money, before the shovels come out.
But they'd still do the 911 calls.
Yes.
And I think for now, my last question is the 207 cells that are sitting in a warehouse somewhere, and the 192 that are out there, 193 that are out there now. Are we going to use the rest of them, install them on our way as we're limping along, or are those just a loss and we should sell them to Puerto Rico? Or I mean, what? It's distressing to me that a plan that is at most 5 years old is found to be so unworkable, unworthwhile.
Well, certainly to put them into commission, we would have to find a carrier willing to do that. And I think with the progression of technology from 2G to 3G, 4G, now we're discussing 5G, though that sounds fairly far away, the interest in these units is not so at best it would be out of a courtesy to us. But certainly to cover certainly to cover the large swaths of land that we're looking at, I think macro is really the best way. And certainly with the move to voice over LTE, I would like to see an LTE solution.
Okay, so at some point in our enthusiasm, and I remember we were going to become the connected state, we made some bad decisions, given they may not have been bad then, because 2G is better than nothing. But we're now looking at 5G, and 2G is pretty inadequate for most things other than 911 or some basic phone calling. But we've got all of these things. And we're not sure that the basic business plan was viable to start with. But, so now we're looking for another business plan. And is that business plan the RFP? Are you looking at, because what we want, I mean, the way technology's going, we're now sitting on a warehouse full of antique microcells. Keep them a few more years, we can probably sell them at a premium. Our interest is in getting cell service, especially emergency wireless service, into these areas. Now, we have hospitals and schools, and I think it was FirstNet, the testimony was they put up one of these mobile, but so the hospitals and the schools were hooked. I'm concerned that we had a hospital going on a 2G system, but so you've taken care of those major, at least temporarily. Who's providing that service?
Mayor, when you're answering that, could you just also just clarify for me, is LTE the same as 4G? Can they be used interchangeably?
I think it's often used interchangeably. LTE stands for long-term evolution. I believe the idea, well, I'm going to go back actually, just a brief statement about Gs. These second generation, third generation, fourth generation, these are actually wireless standards determined by an organization called the International Telecommunications Union. They're an international group. So when all these companies are coming out with 5GE or 4G, 5G or whatever, that's just marketing nonsense because the 5G standard hasn't been developed yet. It hasn't been ratified. So no one actually knows what 5G is.
But we're deploying it.
But we're deploying it in Indianapolis, apparently. So
I think we're deploying it in Putney from the emails I've had.
The idea of 4G LTE was it was going to be a long-term evolution. That means it was going to evolve and change, and that was going to be the last G. But I guess 5G's fine. So, but the federal government, through the Mobility Fund program, is funding 4G LTE service. So that's an indication of where the rural solution lies in their eyes.
I'd like to get an understanding of the timeline that we're talking about currently. The Coverage Co contract was terminated in the summer of 2018, as I recall.
We served notice in August. It was officially terminated in October.
And in terms of your issuance of the RFP for its replacement, knowing that it was, in fact, you knew well before July because of the way it was going, that this wasn't working. So when did the RFP go out?
I believe it went out at the same time we served notice of termination.
So it went out in August, and when did you get responses back?
I have to go back and look at the exact date. I believe it's the end of November.
End of November. So December, January, February, so you've got about 2.5 months that you've been reviewing. When will you make a decision to be able to issue a contract?
Well, we certainly do not want to choose a proposal that we don't have confidence will succeed. And certainly from the proposals that we have, although they're very good, we believe there is more work that needs to be done to ensure that we will find something that will meet our needs.
Are you negotiating with the vendors, in other words, for them to enhance their proposals to
Yes.
a point that might be acceptable?
Yes, and we have questions out there, and so I'm waiting for answers.
In the event that you do not get answers that are satisfactory, do you have a plan B?
As we've discussed in the letter, we are looking at other options, so
By other options, you mean municipal ownership, for example?
municipal ownership,
Of the 2G equipment?
correct. Also, a non-wireless solution could be, and though this is probably not satisfactory, but to use existing landline technology to provide emergency service, much like they do on the interstates and
Payphones along the highway?
And, free phones, yeah. Using continuous emergency access areas to provide basically lit up telephones along the way, which would provide a very cost-effective means of contacting emergency services. And certainly that can be overlaid with crash data, transportation data about where we have traffic issues.
In terms of potential municipal ownership of the existing 2G equipment, have you taken any steps to put a plan together to do that?
Yes, we have written a summary of how that could work.
Okay. And that would require an RFP, though, to find a vendor to do it?
Or perhaps through one of the existing vendors.
I'm sorry?
Or perhaps through one of the vendors who have already applied to our initial RFP.
But no one has been asked to prepare a proposal at this point to do that?
Not a specific written proposal.
Well, as you evaluate the RFP, the results of the RFP that you've got, do you have any timeline by when you'll be finished that process? Did you set any standards for yourself? Because obviously, throughout all this time, you've got these holes that aren't addressed.
Certainly, we understand the time constraints and the concern that people have, but when we issued the RFP, we were not certain that we would get anything at all. And so we are very concerned about making sure that we get a responsible proposal. So until the time that we are satisfied that we'll have something that has some likelihood of success, I don't think we want to issue an award.
Anywhere else in the country that has had similar problems and solved them?
With regard to wireless,
With regard to the problem we have right now, rural areas that don't have coverage provide some kind of interim solution, whether it be through microcells or some other methodology.
certainly several states have broadband and cell programs to which they're committing substantial amounts of money. Yes.
Well, are they doing anything that could be useful to us in terms of how we approach the problem?
I think that most states have recognized that you have to fund a broadband program. So Tennessee's putting forward $45 million for broadband grants. Massachusetts is doing $20 million. Nebraska raised their universal service fund to 6%, and they have a much larger base So they're gonna collect.
Okay, so they're raising more money.
Yes.
I just read an article, and I gave it to the commissioner. Apparently Arkansas, not a particularly wealthy state, has come up with $1 billion. I'd like to know where they got it and why. Are we going after any FCC money aggressively?
We spent time doing that drive test to ensure that we were eligible to get it.
Okay, so are we going after it aggressively now that we've got the drive test?
The FCC hasn't written the rules for how they're going to give out the money, so there's nothing for us to apply to. Phase one was to determine what areas are eligible, and the maps that carriers submitted for the state of Vermont showed that Vermont was over 95% served with LTE service. So that's not just cell coverage, that's really good cell coverage. So our staff spent a month and a half.
% served. Oh, that was the old FCC.
No, this was current FCC. This is a new program. So they asked the carriers, Sprint, T-Mobile,
Yeah, all right,
AT&T.
and they said, and they gave them those same nice green maps that said that cell service, which your drive test said no.
And they gave the states the opportunity to go and challenge that process.
Okay.
37 states did that, including Vermont. And I think we've shown that there are some disparities between.
If we get that money, how will we use it?
That money will be made available, in all likelihood, be made available to carriers to build out to these areas that are unserved. And there are no rules written yet as to which carriers will be eligible. So will there be an allowance for rural wireless carriers, of which there are many? It's our hope that they will be, and that we can.
I'm feeling vibes from the absent Senator McDonald about carriers.
I'm so sorry.
I know. But he would, if he were here, he would be vibrating in his seat about the rural, about the low-hanging fruit, and we're gonna, that the carriers will do the low-hanging fruit, and we will still be left with the last mile. Do we have any ability to have any say? I mean, I think that's part of my issue with the telecom plan is, can we say our telecom plan says that any carrier that wants to do the valley has to do X number up into the hills? I mean, do we have anything that we can hang our hat on there?
Specific to the mobility fund or in general?
In general.
In general. So
To accomplishing that goal.
wireless telecommunications is expressly preempted. States are expressly preempted by the Telecommunications Act. Where we have jurisdiction is over the siting of telecommunications facilities.
Right.
Now, the FCC is working hard to take that away from us, but right now we do have that, and certainly that is an area where states have exercised their authority over wireless.
I just want to go back to something Senator Brock said about this idea that I think you mentioned around municipalities or towns getting access to these 2G microcells that are in the warehouse somewhere. And I'm seeing in the larger report from December that we estimate the cost of running those to be $113 to $147 a month. And I don't know, but I gotta believe even the tiniest town in Vermont might be really interested in footing that bill. And so I hope you will pursue that and aggressively, and make it, to the extent that folks are not willing in your work with them to cover every last area. It seems to me that rather than try to auction these microcells off, we would look at those solutions. I mean, fire departments, whatever, there just seems like there would be a lot of reason to put even this sort of less than ideal technology in a place where somebody has no coverage.
Absolutely.
Could you repeat what that cost, did you say?
Well, in the report, it's between $113 and $147 a month.
That's your
To
electricity.
run them, you gotta have a DSL or something
$50.
fed to them, but it could be copper, right? So that we do have.
It worked in Puerto Rico in a flood.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
And we get, yeah.
Did you have a follow-up on that? I just wanted to go back.
Okay, we're
So I just want to
now
go back,
behind
so
time,
just
then
looking
we'll
at
go
other
on.
states, the only thing that you've really found, just confirm, is that people are spending more money on this. That's it. When you talk with colleagues and have access to other states in terms of their policies, that's the biggest difference.
Yeah, I think people have stopped looking for the broadband connector, and now they're recognizing that you have to pay for it.
Okay.
Okay, real quick, just
Yeah.
one. So in terms of the drive test that you did to figure out coverage, was there, did the government say, okay, if you wanna challenge this, this is the level of discrepancy there needs to be between what the carriers are saying and what you found on the ground in order, you know, to sort of get to the next level, and I'm just curious, where are we in that comparison?
Yes, I mean, they gave us standards that we had to meet, so they split the entire state into 25,000 1 square kilometer blocks.
Okay,
And we had to transact all of these blocks, well, as many blocks as we can.
right,
And show that at least 75% of the block lacked LTE coverage of at least 5 megabits per second down.
so per block, 75% of the block needed
Yeah.
coverage.
And the biggest problem there is that in Vermont, we don't have roads going to all the blocks.
Sure.
Or even to 75% of the
bill.
blocks. But
Right.
the people in those blocks live along the road. So short of getting out of the car and hiking,
Right.
a lot of those blocks were rejected because we couldn't physically get,
Right.
yet there are people in those blocks. So,
Right.
I mean, the whole mapping process is a problem. And certainly Congress is taking a look at that.
Well, that goes to the issue of propagation studies. I noticed in your commentary, you indicated that you were looking for areas that needed coverage not contemplated in the cover code deployment without reliance on expensive and inaccurate propagation studies. Is it your sense that, our cardboard box with phones in it was a more accurate representation of where coverage is than having a propagation study done?
Yes, it's accurate where we were because
Yeah.
it's the user's actual experience on the ground.
The question, though, is would the propagation study cover those areas that you're not able to physically get on the ground to, and which seems to be a substantial number?
Yes, I think the question is whether it covers it accurately or not. Remember, propagation studies are based on assumptions. And my own experience with the Coverage Co project is that assumptions can be wrong. And
So are those assumptions based on propagation studies?
yes. Yeah, the deployment of the Coverage Co project was based on propagation study. But you're relying on assumptions. If the assumptions are correct, they can still be inaccurate because propagation is really an art form. It's not a scientific method. You can ask 10 RF engineers to come up with a propagation study using the same set of statistics, and they might develop different, and like all likelihood they would develop different maps. Where propagation studies are useful is when you are actually deploying a site. So carriers use propagation studies to figure out if the site they have selected is likely going to meet their coverage goals. But to determine where they should start deploying sites, they first rely on actual data, drive test data. So not until they select a site, we're going to build a tower here. It's going to be 120 feet. We're going to use Ericsson antennas. They're going to be pointed this way. That's when they use a propagation study to see if it actually gets to those areas that they're trying to target.
Okay? Okay, Mr. Whitaker, 5 minutes. We're late, so I'm gonna hold you to it.
Well, I think I would request that you reschedule this because the information you got, the incomplete or in some cases misleading information you just got, I can't include or rebuttal in my 5 minutes. What you're seeing here is the cost of a failed telecom plan. I think you need to fundamentally put a hold on the award of any contract because what you heard today and what the letter from Clay Purvis illustrates is that we didn't get any responses to the RFP that we put out. And in effect, they're negotiating a new scope of work or solutions outside of the RFP that was put out, and that's unfair to all other potential competitors. So this is, again, like FirstNet, a disconnected initiative that should be a fundamental chapter and strategy in the telecom plan. So what can we do to utilize the existing cells? The PUC could implement a reduced rate for microcell specifically. You can do private DSL, which does not connect to the internet in order to route these, and it would be regulatable under Vermont law. That Coverage Co. was told in their petition to the PUC that because they used ADSL, which connected to a Fairpoint switch in Albany, it was an interstate unregulated internet service. There is a way to backhaul these microcells without the internet service that is being preempting us. I'm very concerned with this idea that we would have the potential to apply to a second carrier, or that we would throw our entire microcell future and prerogative into one vendor's hands when they may or may not be required to implement neutral host with all carriers. In effect, the example that the chair gave of having to have both a Verizon and an AT&T phone to drive to Danville and back and maintain coverage, we don't want. How many phones is a first responder going to have to carry? How many phones is a tourist going to have to carry in order to be safe?
Well, they gotta get 911.
This phone will not connect to any of the VTEL towers. You know, VTEL is a 4G LTE only, and I still rely on a 3G flip phone. So does the automobile I drive. So my point is that we need a comprehensive plan and a strategy, and the most effective way to accomplish is to temporarily make the microcells available for the state to provide the backhaul routing and carrier settlements, the billing between of all the carriers, and then to allow the municipalities or fire departments to provide the electricity and the DSL or cable modem, especially if that could be on a reduced tariff rate from I know that Comcast provides a $9 service, I believe, to some low-income people. Similar provision could be provided for these as resiliency sites so that every community could have 3 or 4 places where you could get near them and make a 911 call. To me, that is best use of the investment we've made so far. But I would say fundamentally pause any award of any exclusive or long-term. They've been talking about a 20-year contract for microcell management, and now they're switching it to an entire different scope. I'm familiar with the Aerostat blimp model. I brought them up to speed on what the regulatory environment is here. I was totally shocked that the department bought into that. I got a few more notes. Intrado was providing the geolocation service, and they had to do it for 2 different technologies. I was trying to help salvage the coverage code model, and I learned that they were paying that fee twice because they were supporting both the GSM and the CDMA technology. Also, what I didn't hear in the discussion is how does any of this relate to Band 14? If these LTE sites are going in, well, they can't be allowed to go in absent a telecom plan. That's our bottom line, is that in effect we're in this mess because the VTA was operating. It was the director of the VTA who left the department,
Some of us are familiar with that.
so there has not been a telecom plan
No,
since he left the VTA, and then all this VTA money was spent in the absence of a plan.
Yep.
And we're still operating in the absence of a plan. So I would ask you, in order to get this right, and you'll see some legislation, I think, in speaking to this, that we pause